The copper pot did not just strike the man, it felt like a physical extension of Clara's own boiling resentment, a heavy, metallic judgment that sang a single discordant note of rebellion against the morning air. When the rim of the pot connected with the deputy's temple, the sound was not the sharp ring of metal on stone, but a sickeningly soft, wet thud, the sound of a life being violently interrupted. Clara felt the jar of the impact travel up her thin, corded arms, a vibration that settled deep in her marrow and made her teeth ache. Deputy Horace didn't scream. He simply folded, his knees buckled with a mechanical clumsiness that reminded Clara of a newborn calf, and he hit the dirt face first with a heavy, final thump. Blood, dark and hot, splattered across the hem of Clara's torn calico dress, the droplets feeling like tiny, wrong pinpricks of heat against her skin. Behind her, the world dissolved into a cacophony of terror. Lily's high-pitched wail pierced the silence like a needle through silk, while Tommy's voice broke in a panicked shout, a sound caught between the boy he was and the man he was being forced to become. The sheriff, Thaddeus Burke, was already reaching for the iron on his hip, his eyes wide with a predatory, cold-blooded rage that promised a slow death. "Run!" Clara's voice was a rasp, a command birthed in the very pit of her stomach as she gripped Sammy's cold, limp hand. "Run now! Don't you dare look back!" 3 hours earlier, the world had been a much quieter kind of hell, draped in the suffocating grey of a Montana dawn that refused to break. Clara Ruth Whitfield had spent those hours praying, not the sort of prayer one hears in a white-steepled church with folded hands and a peaceful heart, but the desperate, jagged bargaining of someone who had already lost everything but her breath. She sat in the corner of an abandoned barn that smelled of ancient rot, damp earth, and the metallic tang of the coming winter frost. To a casual observer, the barn was a skeleton of cedar and rust, but to Clara, it was a fortress, the only thing keeping the biting wind from stealing what little warmth remained in her siblings' bodies. Her prayer was a low, rhythmic mutter, a frantic deal offered to a god she feared had turned his back on the territory. "Just one more day," she whispered into the rafters, her voice barely audible over the scurrying of mice in the hay. "Just give us the dawn and let us have the strength to leave this place behind." Beside her, 3-year-old Lily coughed, a wet, rattling sound that had kept Clara awake for 3 consecutive nights. It was a sound that seemed too heavy, too ancient for such a small chest, a rattling reminder that the cold was a patient hunter. Every time the child struggled for air, Clara felt another thread of her own resolve fray, yet she forced herself to remain a pillar of stone, the unyielding center of their crumbling world. Tommy, at 10 years old, was a shadow moving through the gloom of the barn's interior. He crawled toward Clara, his knees scuffing against the packed dirt floor with a sound like dry leaves. He was a boy who had spent the last 6 months trying to fill a vacuum left by a father who had decided that 5 hungry mouths were a burden too heavy to carry. Tommy puffed out his chest and spoke of hunting and protection, but in the dim, early light, Clara could see the unmistakable tremor in his lower lip. He was a child playing a man's part in a tragedy he hadn't authored, and the weight of it was beginning to stoop his shoulders. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a ghost in the shadows as he settled beside her. His bony shoulder pressed against hers, a silent plea for a reassurance she wasn't sure she could truthfully give. "I keep thinking about that ranch Mrs. Patterson mentioned. Stone Creek. What if the man there is mean? What if he's worse than the sheriff?" Clara reached out and gripped the handle of the copper pot resting in the hay beside her. It was the only heirloom she had managed to snatch when the creditors came for their home, a battered, dented thing that had once cooked her mother's Sunday stews. In the darkness, the metal felt cold and honest. "He needs a cook, Tommy," she said, her voice setting into a line of granite. "And I can cook. I've been doing it since I was 7. Men like Mallister don't care about the age of the hands, only the quality of the work. If we are useful, we are safe." The silence in the barn was occasionally broken by the restless movements of Sammy, who sat apart from the others. At 5 years old, Sammy was a boy who had retreated into a fortress of silence so thick that no words could penetrate it. He hadn't uttered a single sound since the morning he woke up to find his father's bed empty, no note, no explanation, just a cold, hollow space where a parent's love should have been. The town doctor in Willow Springs had called it nervous shock, a clinical term for a heart that had simply decided it was done with the world. Clara looked at him and saw a ghost inhabiting a small body, his eyes fixed on a hole in the roof as if he were waiting for the sky to fall and finish the job. Beside him, 8-year-old Mercy hummed a tuneless, soft melody to keep the baby Lily from waking in a panic. Mercy was the musician of the family, a girl who filled the terrifying gaps of silence with made-up songs, weaving a safety net of sound around them. It was her way of pretending the world wasn't a dark, hungry place. Clara watched them all, the sick baby, the silent boy, the humming girl, and the terrified protector, and felt a fierce, burning protectiveness that eclipsed her own fear. They were Whitfields, and if the world wanted to break them, it was going to have to work for it. She checked the meager bundle of their belongings one last time, ensuring the copper pot was secured. It was her weapon, her tool, and her history, all in one. "We leave at first light," she told Tommy, her eyes fixed on the sliver of grey under the barn door. "And God help anyone who tries to stop us." The plan had been so simple in the quiet of the night, but plans had a way of curdling when they met the reality of the trail. Clara's goal was to reach the general store on the edge of town, find Mrs. Patterson, a woman whose kindness was the only thing that hadn't been foreclosed on, and get the specific directions to Stone Creek Ranch. It was a 15-mile journey through some of the roughest timber and ravine country in the territory, a distance that felt like 1,000 miles to a girl carrying a sick toddler and leading a silent boy. As the first pale rays of the sun began to bleed through the cedar slats of the barn, Clara woke the children with hushed, urgent whispers. They moved like mice, practiced in the art of being invisible. They slipped out into the biting morning air, the frost crunching like broken glass under their worn-out boots. Keeping to the dense tree line, they avoided the main road, circling toward the back of the Willow Springs settlement. Clara felt the weight of Lily on her hip, the child's feverish heat seeping through her own thin layers. Every crack of a twig sounded like a gunshot in the stillness of the dawn. They were vagrants now, orphans in the eyes of the state, and the state had a very specific, very cruel plan for children like them. Sheriff Burke had already made it clear that the orphans were to be separated, the boys to the Holbrook labor farm, the girls to the asylum in Helena. To Burke, they weren't children, they were ledger entries, headcounts that translated into state-funded bounties. Clara knew that if they were caught, she would never see her brothers or sisters again. They reached the trough behind the livery stable just as the town began to stir with the sounds of opening shutters and the distant ringing of a blacksmith's hammer. Clara left the children huddled behind the heavy wood of the water trough, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Don't move!" she hissed at Tommy, her eyes wide and commanding. "If you see anyone, you take them into the woods and you don't wait for me. You hear?" Tommy's face was ash-grey, but he nodded, his small hands gripping Sammy's coat. Clara darted across the open ground toward the back porch of the general store, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She found Mrs. Patterson sweeping the boards, her grey hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. The old woman gasped when she saw Clara, dropping her broom with a clatter. "Lord have mercy, child. I thought you were miles away by now," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the street. "The sheriff has been looking for you since midnight. He knows you didn't leave on the stagecoach." Clara didn't waste time on pleasantries. "The ranch, ma'am. Stone Creek. How do we get there?" Mrs. Patterson's face creased with a deep maternal worry. "Zeke Mallister is a hard man, Clara. He's lost his soul to the same fire that took his family. He won't take kindly to 5 strays. "I'm not a stray," Clara snapped, her voice trembling. "I'm a cook. Just tell me the way." The old woman sighed and pointed toward the north road. "Follow the creek until the water turns white over the stones. Take the fork to the right, toward the mountains. And Clara, take these." She pressed 2 warm biscuits into Clara's hand, her eyes glistening with a pity that Clara didn't want but couldn't afford to refuse. The walk back to the water trough felt like an eternity. Every shadow seemed to morph into the tall, imposing figure of Thaddeus Burke. She was halfway across the clearing when the livery stable door creaked open and the world went cold. Sheriff Burke stepped out, his spurs jangling with a slow, deliberate rhythm that signaled he had been waiting. Beside him was Deputy Horace, a man whose neck was thicker than his skull and whose eyes held the dull vacancy of a predator. "Well now, if it isn't the little mother herself," Burke said, his voice a smooth, oily drawl that made Clara's skin crawl. "I was just telling Horace here that a girl like you wouldn't leave her litter behind. You've got that look in your eye, Clara. The same look your mother had before she gave up the ghost." Clara froze, her hand instinctively going to the bundle at her side, her fingers brushing the cold copper of the pot. "We aren't doing anything wrong, Sheriff. We're just leaving." Burke laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "The law says different. Judge Morrison signed the order yesterday. You children are wards of the territory now. We're here to see you placed in proper homes." He signaled to Horace, who began to move toward the water trough where the children were hiding. "No!" Clara shouted, but it was too late. Horace reached the trough and yanked Tommy out by the collar, throwing the boy to the ground. Mercy screamed as the deputy grabbed her by the hair, and Sammy stood frozen, his eyes squeezed shut, as if he could disappear if he only tried hard enough. Burke watched with a bored, detached cruelty. "It's for the best, Clara. You can't feed them. You can't keep them. Give it up." That was the moment the world fractured. Later, Clara wouldn't remember making the conscious decision to reach into her bundle. She wouldn't remember the weight of the copper pot as she swung it with both hands, using every ounce of her 5-foot frame to generate momentum. All she remembered was the sight of Horace's hand on Mercy's hair and the sound of Tommy hitting the dirt. The impact was a roar in her ears. The deputy dropped like a slaughtered hog, his life force leaking into the Montana dust. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Burke's hand froze on his holster, his eyes reflecting a shock that bordered on disbelief. A 12-year-old girl had just broken his best man. You little bitch," Burke hissed, the board mask finally slipping to reveal the monster beneath. He drew his pistol, the black iron glinting in the morning sun. Clara didn't wait. She grabbed Sammy and Lily, shoving them toward the timber. "Tommy, get them out of here, now!" They fled into the darkness of the trees just as the first gunshot echoed through the valley, the lead whistling past Clara's ear like a hornet. They ran until their lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass, until the sounds of the town were replaced by the frantic thrumming of their own hearts. They were fugitives now, hunted animals with the law at their heels, and their only hope lay 15 miles north at a ranch owned by a man who was said to have a heart made of stone. Clara looked down at her hands. They were shaking, stained with Deputy Horace's blood, and she gripped the copper pot tighter. It was no longer just a tool for cooking. It was the heavy, blood-stained seal of a covenant she had made with her family. They would stay together, or they would die together. The trek through the timber was a grueling test of will. The ground was a treacherous maze of fallen pine needles and slick, hidden roots that threatened to twist an ankle with every step. Clara carried Lily on her hip, the child's weight feeling like a leaden anchor as the miles stretched on. Tommy led Sammy, the two boys moving in a silent, terrified rhythm. Behind them, they could hear the distant, intermittent baying of hounds. Burke wasn't going to let them go. He couldn't. Not after what Clara had done. To let a girl best a deputy was a blow to his authority that he could only heal with blood. Every time the wind shifted, Clara imagined she could hear the jangle of spurs or the heavy breathing of men. They crossed Miller's Creek where the water was hip-deep and icy, the current tugging at their legs like a physical hand trying to pull them under. Sammy slipped, his head going under for a terrifying second, but Tommy hauled him up, the two of them shivering so violently their teeth clattered. They didn't stop to dry off. They couldn't. They kept moving, fueled by a mixture of adrenaline and a desperate primal need to survive. Clara's mind was a whirlwind of recipes and measurements, a strange coping mechanism that kept her from collapsing. She counted the steps in terms of biscuit batches, 10 steps for the flour, 20 for the lard, 50 for the kneading. It was a way to quantify the impossible distance. By the time the sun reached its zenith, they were deep in the foothills, the towering peaks of the mountains looming over them like silent judges. Lily's cough had grown worse, a sharp, barking sound that echoed too loudly in the stillness of the woods. Clara stopped only long enough to press the last of Mrs. Patterson's biscuits into the children's mouths, refusing to take a bite for herself. As evening began to drape the valleys in long, purple shadows, the trees thinned, revealing a sprawling expanse of high country pasture. In the center of the valley sat a two-story log house, sturdy and defiant against the elements. Outbuildings, barns and corrals stretched out like the limbs of a great beast. This was Stone Creek Ranch. It looked like a fortress of industry, a place where weakness went to die. Clara stood at the edge of the clearing, her breath coming in ragged plumes. She looked at her siblings, ragged, shivering, and covered in the dust of the trail, and then she looked at the copper pot in her hand. The blood on its rim had dried to a dull, dark brown, a permanent mark of the price she had paid to get them here. "Stay here," she told Tommy, her voice barely a whisper, "in the shadows of the barn. If I don't come back in 10 minutes, you take them and you keep going north. You don't stop until you hit the next territory." Tommy's eyes were wide and swimming with tears. "Clara, please don't leave us." "I'm not leaving you," she said, cupping his face. "I'm going to find us a home." She straightened her dress as best she could, wiped the soot from her forehead, and began the long walk toward the front gate. Every step felt like she was walking toward a gallows, but she kept her head high. She reached the heavy oak gate just as two ranch hands looked up from their work, their expressions shifting from boredom to utter disbelief. "Lord in heaven," one muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Where'd you come from, little miss? The sky?" Clara didn't answer. She kept walking until she reached the porch steps of the main house. "I'm looking for Mr. Mallister," she said, her voice ringing out with a clarity that surprised even her. "I heard he needs a cook." The door to the house creaked open, and a man stepped out into the dying light. Zeke Mallister was a mountain of a man, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, and his face carved from the same unforgiving granite as the peaks behind him. His eyes were the color of wood smoke, grey and cold, and utterly devoid of warmth. He looked at Clara, then his gaze drifted to the blood-stained copper pot in her hand, and then to the four ragged shapes crouching in the shadows of his barn. He didn't speak for a long moment, the silence between them stretching until it felt like it would snap. "I don't hire children," he said finally, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that felt like it came from the earth itself. "I hire workers, and I don't take in strays." Clara took a step forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the pot. "I'm not a stray, and I'm not a child. I'm the best cook you'll ever find in this territory. I can make a meal out of scraps and sunshine, and I can work from sunup to sundown without a complaint." Mallister narrowed his eyes, his gaze fixed on the dried blood on her dress. "That blood on your skirt, whose is it?" Clara didn't flinch. "A man who tried to take my family away. And I'd do it again if I had to." Mallister went still, a strange flicker of something passing through his dead eyes. Not pity, but a dark, recognizing respect. He looked at the children again, then back at Clara. "1 week," he said, the words falling like stones. "You have 1 week to prove you're worth the food you eat. If you fail, you're gone, and those children stay out of my sight. I don't want to hear them, and I don't want to see them. Do we have an understanding?" Clara nodded once, her heart soaring even as her body threatened to collapse. "We have an understanding, Mr. Mallister." She turned and signaled to Tommy, watching as her family emerged from the shadows like ghosts coming back to life. They had a roof, they had a chance, and as long as Clara had her copper pot and the fire in her gut, she was going to make sure they never had to run again. The kitchen quarters were less of a home and more of a drafty afterthought, a small two-room structure bolted onto the side of the main house like a barnacle on a ship's hull. The air inside was heavy with the scent of old wood smoke and the lingering chill of a house that had long since forgotten the touch of a woman's hand. As Jonas led them inside, the floorboards groaned under their weight, a weary sound that seemed to echo the exhaustion settled deep in Clara's bones. The furniture was sparse, 2 narrow cots with thin grey wool blankets, a single scarred table, and a small wood-burning stove that looked like it hadn't seen a fire since the last winter. There was no colour here, no softness. It was a space designed for survival, not for living. Tommy immediately moved to the corner, his eyes darting toward the single window that overlooked the pitch-black paddocks, his body still wound tight with the instinct to flee. Lily was already asleep on Clara's shoulder, her breathing a shallow, ragged whistle that made the silence of the room feel dangerous. Clara laid her sister down on the nearest cot, the child's feverish heat radiating through the thin mattress. She looked at her family, ragged, hollow-eyed, and covered in the dust of a 15-mile nightmare, and felt the crushing weight of the promise she had made. They were in the lion's den now, and the only way to keep from being eaten was to be the most useful thing the lion had ever seen. She set the copper pot on the small table, the metal catching the moonlight like a battered crown. This was their anchor. Clara did not sleep that first night. She merely drifted in a state of hypervigilance, her ears tuned to the unfamiliar rhythms of the ranch. Outside, the wind howled through the ravines, a lonely, predatory sound that was punctuated by the distant, rhythmic lowing of cattle and the occasional sharp crack of a settling timber. Every creak of the floorboards in the main house felt like a footstep toward their door, and every hoot of an owl sounded like Burke's whistle. She spent the hours between midnight and dawn staring at the ceiling, her mind cataloguing the ingredients Jonas had mentioned: flour, lard, bacon, coffee. In her head she was already measuring, already kneading, already planning the logistics of feeding 17 hardened men who would have no patience for a girl's mistakes. The copper pot sat beside her bed, its presence a cold comfort. It had been her mother's weapon of choice against hunger, and now it was Clara's weapon against the world. She thought of her mother's hands, scarred by grease and heat, but always gentle, and she tried to summon that same steady strength into her own trembling fingers. To Zeke Mallister, she was a gamble he expected to lose. To her siblings, she was the sky and the earth. To the law, she was a criminal, but here, in the suffocating dark of the kitchen quarters, she was simply a girl who refused to let the fire go out. When the first hint of grey light touched the window, she was already on her feet, the transition from exhaustion to action as seamless as a soldier's. The trial had begun. The kitchen was a cavernous space dominated by a massive black iron wood stove that looked like a slumbering beast. The air was frigid, the kind of cold that bit into your joints and stayed there, but Clara moved with a frantic, focused energy. She had a fire roaring within minutes, the dry cedar kindling popping and snapping as it took hold, sending a wave of cedar-scented heat into the room. She worked in a silence so absolute it felt sacred, her hands moving with a muscle memory that defied her 12 years. She found the flour barrel, a heavy oak-staved thing, and began the alchemy of the morning. Flour, salt, a pinch of soda, and cold, hard lard that she rubbed in with her fingertips until the mixture looked like coarse sand. This was the foundation of her mother's biscuits, a recipe that had been polished by generations of poverty until it was a masterpiece of simplicity. She added the buttermilk, mixing just enough to bind the dough, her movements light and deliberate. Overworking the dough was a sin that led to heavy bread, and Clara knew that a heavy biscuit was a one-way ticket back to the road. She rolled the dough out on the floured work table, her mother's copper pot standing nearby like a silent sentinel. As she cut the circles, clean, sharp edges that promised a high rise, the sun began to pull itself over the horizon, casting long golden fingers across the flour-dusted floor. The smell began to change then, shifting from the raw scent of cold grain to the warm, yeasty promise of the oven. She was building their fortress out of flour and fire. By the time the sun was fully up, the kitchen was a sensory battlefield. The bacon was thick-cut and salty, curling in the heavy cast-iron skillets with a hiss that sounded like applause. Clara had found a jar of dried sage in the pantry, and she crumbled a handful into the gravy, the herb releasing a pungent, earthy aroma that cut through the richness of the pork fat. She eggs scrambled with cream, whisking them until they were a pale, frothy yellow before pouring them into a buttered pan. The biscuits were the centerpiece, 3 dozen of them, golden brown and towering, their tops brushed with melted butter until they glistened. The coffee was a dark, viscous brew, strong enough to wake a dead man and bitter enough to make him glad he was alive. Tommy had slipped into the kitchen at some point, his face scrubbed clean but his eyes still wary. He didn't speak, but he took the heavy pans from Clara, his young muscles straining as he set them on the long communal table in the dining hall. He moved like a ghost, terrified that a single loud sound would bring the granite-faced Mallister down upon them. Clara watched him, her heart aching at the sight of his hollowed cheeks and the way he flinched at the sound of the stove's iron door. "It's okay, Tommy," she whispered, though she wasn't sure it was true. "Just keep your head down and the food hot. That's all we have to do." The scent of breakfast was a summons. The men filed in at precisely 6 o'clock, a phalanx of worn leather, sweat-stained hats, and the heavy metallic scent of horses. They were big men, carved from the same hard landscape as the ranch itself, and they stopped short at the sight of the spread on the table. For a year, they had been eating the scorched, uninspired offerings of a string of failed cooks, and the sight of Clara's biscuits seemed to hit them like a physical blow. Jonas led the way, his eyebrows disappearing into his hairline as he took in the scene. He looked at Clara, then at the food, then back at Clara, a slow, disbelieving grin spreading across his face. "Lord Almighty, Miss Clara," he breathed, the scent of the sage gravy already making his mouth water. "You did all this? By yourself?" Clara didn't answer with words. She simply held the coffee pot, her face a mask of professional calm, even as her knees threatened to buckle. The men sat, and for the first 10 minutes, the only sounds were the scraping of forks on tin plates and the low, guttural groans of men who had forgotten what a real meal tasted like. They ate with a ferocity that was almost frightening, a silent tribute to the quality of her work. One young cowhand, no more than 18, looked up from his third biscuit with an expression that bordered on religious awe. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with gravy and genuine respect, "if this is what a week's trial looks like, I'll personally shoot anyone who tries to fire you." The first victory was won in the gut. While the men ate, Clara prepared a separate tray for Zeke Mallister. She chose the best of the biscuits, the ones that had risen the highest, and arranged the eggs and bacon with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. She found a small, chipped ceramic bowl and filled it with a golden, viscous honey she had discovered at the back of the pantry, drizzling it over the tops of the warm bread. This was the sunshine her mother had always talked about, the small, sweet grace that made a hard life bearable. Carrying the tray felt like carrying a bomb. She was acutely aware that the man in the study was the arbiter of their fate, a man whose heart was rumored to be as cold as the mountain runoff. She navigated the long, silent hallway of the main house, her boots sounding too loud on the hardwood floors. The house felt like a tomb, a grand structure that had been hollowed out by grief until only the shell remained. She reached the heavy oak door of the study and knocked, a sharp, clear sound that felt like a challenge. "What?" The voice from inside was a low, dangerous rumble. Clara didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed the door open and entered. Mallister was sitting behind a desk piled high with ledgers, his face obscured by the shadows of the morning. He didn't look up, but the scent of the biscuits seemed to precede her, filling the stale air of the room with a sudden, vibrant warmth. She set the tray on the edge of the desk, the honey-drizzled biscuits gleaming in the light of his single lamp. The air in the room grew heavy. Mallister didn't move for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the tray as if it were a strange and potentially hostile object. He picked up one of the biscuits, his large, calloused fingers looking impossibly clumsy against the delicate, flaky bread. He took a bite, his jaw working slowly, and then he went completely still. Clara watched him, her breath caught in her throat. She saw the way his eyes tightened, the way his shoulders slumped just a fraction of an inch. "This honey," he said, his voice strange and distant, like a man talking in his sleep. "You added honey?" Clara nodded, her voice steady. "My mother used to call it sunshine to bread, sir. Said it made the morning easier to face." Mallister set the biscuit back down, his hands trembling with a sudden violent intensity. He looked at her then, and for a fleeting second the granite mask slipped, revealing a cavernous raw pain that made Clara want to look away. "My wife, Mary Ellen." She said the same thing. The silence that followed was suffocating, a thick, heavy blanket of shared grief that bridged the gap between the 12-year-old girl and the broken man. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the mask slammed back into place. "Get out!" he snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "Leave the tray and get out!" Clara didn't argue. She turned and fled back to the safety of her kitchen. The memory of his trembling hands burned into her mind. She had touched a nerve. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of steam and grease and the relentless demands of the kitchen. Clara scrubbed the heavy skillets until they shone, the lye soap biting into the small cuts on her hands, but she welcomed the pain. It was a distraction from the crushing uncertainty of their situation. She managed the children with a series of hushed commands, keeping them contained in the small back room of the quarters. Tommy was tasked with whittling kindling, his knife moving in a rhythmic shuck, shuck, shuck that calmed his nerves. Mercy was told to hum to Lily, a low, sweet sound that kept the toddler from crying out and drawing Mallister's ire. Sammy, however, was the hardest to manage. He sat in the corner of the kitchen, his dark eyes following Clara's every move, his silence a heavy weight in the room. He didn't play, he didn't eat, he simply existed in a state of quiet, watchful waiting. Clara reached out and ruffled his hair as she passed, but he didn't flinch or acknowledge her touch. He was a boy who had seen the bottom of the world and was still waiting to hit the floor. "We're okay, Sammy," she whispered, leaning down to press her forehead against his. "We've got a roof. We've got food. Just hold on a little longer." She could feel the tension in his small frame, the way he was braced for the next blow. They were safe for the moment, but Clara knew that safety on Stone Creek was a fragile thing, held together by flour, honey, and the unpredictable whims of a man who lived with ghosts. The shadow of the sheriff still loomed. By noon, the second meal of the day was prepared. A hearty roast with potatoes that had been simmered in beef stock until they were as soft as butter. The men ate with the same grim efficiency as before, though this time there was more chatter, more laughter, the tension of the ranch easing under the influence of a full stomach. Jonas lingered after the others had left, his hat in his hands as he leaned against the doorframe. "You've done a fine thing here, Miss Clara," he said, his voice low so as not to carry to the main house. "The boss, he cleaned that tray, every crumb. I haven't seen him eat like that since the fire." He paused, his expression growing serious. "But you be careful. He's a man who's built a wall around himself for a reason. You start poking holes in that wall with your biscuits and your talk of sunshine, and he might just lash out." Clara looked at the empty skillets, her reflection distorted in the polished metal. "I'm not trying to poke holes in anything, Mr. Jonas. I'm just trying to keep my family together." Jonas nodded, his eyes kind. "I know you are, child. I know you are." As he turned to leave, Clara felt a sudden, sharp spike of anxiety. The week was 7 days long, and they had only survived one. Outside, the Montana sky was a brilliant, pitiless blue, and the mountains looked like the teeth of a giant. They were far from the law, far from the sheriff, but they were also far from help. The real test was yet to come. The third day at Stone Creek Ranch began not with the sun, but with the bone-deep cold that precedes a Montana dawn, a blue-black frost that seemed to settle in the very joints of the log house. Clara was already at her post, her hands moving through the rhythmic labor of the kitchen as if she were part of the machinery itself. The "don't see, don't hear" rule Zeke Mallister had imposed hung over the kitchen quarters like a heavy fog, stifling the children's natural inclinations to laugh or cry. Tommy sat in the corner, his eyes fixed on the door, while Mercy hummed a song so quiet it was barely a vibration in the air. The psychological weight of their invisibility was beginning to show. The children were becoming like the shadows they inhabited, pale and quiet, their spirits dampened by the constant need for silence. Clara felt the sting of lye soap on her cracked knuckles as she scrubbed the massive iron pots, her mind racing with the logistics of their survival. Every time the heavy boots of a ranch hand thudded on the porch, the children would freeze, their breath catching in a collective, terrified pause. It was a state of constant low-grade trauma, a continuation of the flight that had begun in Willow Springs. Clara knew that if they didn't get air soon, if they didn't reclaim some small part of their childhood from the grip of fear, they would break in a way that even her biscuits couldn't fix. She was a girl holding a dam together with her bare hands, watching for the first sign of a crack. The silence was shattered not by a threat, but by the unexpected presence of Zeke Mallister. He appeared in the kitchen doorway just as the men were finishing their coffee, his massive frame casting a shadow that stretched across the flowered work table. He looked less like a statue of granite today, and more like a man plagued by ghosts. There were dark circles beneath his smoke-grey eyes, and his hands, usually so steady, toyed restlessly with the brim of his hat. He didn't look at Clara directly, but his voice, when it came, lacked the jagged edge of his previous commands. "The meadow behind the east barn," he said, the words sounding forced, as if he were unlearning a long-practiced silence. "The grass is high, and there's a creek. It's out of the way of the cattle. Take the young ones there." Clara froze, her hands mid-kneed in a fresh batch of dough. The invitation felt like a trap, a sudden loosening of the leash that she wasn't sure how to navigate. Zeke cleared his throat, a rough sound that vibrated in the small space. "There used to be frogs," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "My daughter, Emma. She'd bring them home in her pockets until her mama threatened to tan both their hides." The mention of his daughter's name was a seismic event, a sudden, raw opening in the man's armor that left the room feeling heavy with a grief that wasn't Clara's, but that she recognized all too well. He turned and left before she could offer a word of thanks, leaving behind the scent of pine and old, unhealed sorrow. Stepping out of the kitchen quarters was like stepping into a different world, one where the sky didn't have a ceiling and the air didn't taste of grease and soot. The children moved into the sunlight with a hesitant, blinking wonder, their ragged clothes catching the wind as they walked toward the east meadow. It was a vast, golden expanse of high country grass, rimmed by the dark, serrated edge of the timberline and the towering, snow-capped peaks that stood like silent guardians over the valley. For the first time in 6 months, the children weren't running. They were simply walking. The psychological relief was visible in the way Mercy's shoulders dropped and the way Tommy let go of Sammy's hand, allowing the 5-year-old to drift through the grass. The creek was a ribbon of melted ice, the water so clear it looked like liquid glass over the smooth, multicolored stones. Lily let out a small, tentative giggle as she splashed her hands in the cold water, a sound that felt as precious as gold in the mountain air. Even Sammy seemed to change. He didn't speak, but his dark eyes lost some of their glassy emptiness as he watched the minnows dart through the shadows of the bank. It was a fragile peace, a stolen moment of normalcy in a life that had become a series of escapes. Clara watched them from the edge of the creek, her copper pot resting in the grass beside her, feeling the sun on her face and the slow, steady return of hope to her weary heart. However, the peace was not complete until they reached the stables on their way back. Zeke was there, waiting in the shadows of the overhang, holding the reins of a horse that looked like a creature out of a dream. She was a chestnut mare with a coat that gleamed like polished mahogany and a stark white blaze that ran down the center of her nose. "This is Molly," Zeke said, his voice softer than Clara had ever heard it. "She was Emma's horse, ain't been ridden since the fire. She's gentle, but she's lonely. Most things on this ranch are." He looked at Sammy, who had stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes fixed on the horse with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. The boy who hadn't spoken, who hadn't smiled, who moved through the world like a ghost, took a tentative step toward the mare. Molly lowered her head, her soft velvet muzzle reaching out to sniff the air around the small boy. The scent of hay, leather and horse seemed to pull Sammy out of his internal fortress. His small, trembling hand reached out, his fingers brushing against the horse's nose. Molly let out a soft, rhythmic nicker, a sound of greeting that seemed to vibrate through Sammy's entire frame. For the first time since their father had disappeared, a slow, genuine smile broke across Sammy's face, a light that seemed to chase away the shadows in his eyes. He pressed his forehead against the horse's muzzle, his small shoulders shaking as he let out a jagged, silent sob of relief. Zeke Mallister watched the scene with an expression that made Clara's heart ache. The granite was crumbling, and beneath it was a man who was terrified of the very connection he was fostering. He reached out and lifted Sammy onto Molly's back with a tenderness that was at odds with his towering frame, his large hands supporting the boy as if he were made of fine china. As he walked the horse in a slow, deliberate circle around the paddock, Clara saw the transformation taking place. It wasn't just Sammy who was being healed. It was Zeke. Every step the horse took seemed to bridge the gap between the man's past and this unexpected present. Jonas, the old foreman, watched from the porch of the bunkhouse, his hat tipped back, a look of profound respect in his eyes as he watched his boss come back to life. "He's a good man, Miss Clara," Jonas whispered as she approached. "Just had to find a reason to remember it. You and these little ones. You're the first rain this land has seen in 7 years." But the beauty of the moment was shadowed by the reality of their situation. Clara knew that the sheriff was still out there, and that the legal world would not look kindly on a hermit rancher harboring 5 wanted orphans. The psychological bond they were forming was a shield, but it was also a target. As Sammy rode the horse, his first words, "Molly, pretty Molly," fell into the air like a miracle, a sound that brought the whole family to tears and signaled the beginning of a war they weren't yet prepared to fight. The miracle of Sammy's voice, however, was short-lived, as the sound of approaching hooves soon echoed from the ranch road, not the rhythmic, familiar beat of ranch horses returning from the range, but the heavy, synchronized thud of lawmen. Clara felt the temperature in the yard drop as 3 riders crested the rise, their badges glinting like cold stars in the afternoon sun. Sheriff Thaddeus Burke led the pack, his face a mask of oily satisfaction, and beside him sat a woman who looked like the physical manifestation of a winter storm. She was dressed in a high-collared black dress that seemed to absorb the light, her grey hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful. This was Mrs. Prudence Ashworth, the superintendent of the Helena Orphan Asylum, a woman whose name was used to frighten children into obedience. Clara instinctively gathered the children behind her, her hand finding the handle of the copper pot, her heart hammer-milling against her ribs. The transition from the warmth of Sammy's voice to the icy presence of the law was a violent psychological jolt. Burke reined his horse in at the gate, his eyes scanning the yard until they landed on Clara. "Well now, Mallister," Burke called out, his voice a smooth, dangerous drawl. "I heard you were looking for a cook, but I didn't think you were looking for a murderer and a pack of thieves. Step aside and let us collect what belongs to the state." Zeke Mallister did not step aside. He moved with a slow, deliberate lethality, stepping in front of the gate and leveling his rifle at the sheriff's chest. The air grew thick with the smell of dust and impending violence. "The only thing on this land that belongs to the state is the dirt under your horse's hooves, Burke," Zeke said, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "These children are under my protection. You want them, you're going to have to walk through me to get them." Mrs. Ashworth leaned forward, her voice thin and sharp like a razor blade. "Mr. Mallister, harboring fugitives is a federal offense. These children are orphans. They require the discipline and guidance of the asylum. You are a man living in a tomb. You have no right to these souls." The psychological warfare was palpable, the weight of the law and morality being used as a bludgeon against the raw, emotional truth of the ranch. Burke grinned, a sight that made Clara's skin crawl. "I got the papers, Zeke, signed by Judge Morrison. You can play hero all you want, but at the end of the day, you're just a man with a gun against a world that says you're wrong." The standoff lasted for a grueling 10 minutes, the silence broken only by the restless stomping of the lawman's horses. Clara watched Zeke's back, the broad, unyielding line of his shoulders, and realized that he was making a choice that would define the rest of his life. He wasn't just defending them, he was reclaiming his own right to be a father, a protector, and a man. The confrontation ended not with gunfire, but with a strategic retreat. Burke, seeing the armed ranch hands emerging from the bunkhouse with their own rifles, realized that a direct assault would be a massacre he couldn't justify to the territory. "This isn't over, Mallister," Burke spat, wheeling his horse around. "You can't hide them forever. The fire always finds the fuel." Mrs. Ashworth gave Clara a look of such profound, cold disapproval that the girl felt as though she had been cursed. As the lawman rode away, the dust settling back onto the road, the ranch felt changed. The peace of the meadow was gone, replaced by a jagged, high-strung tension. Zeke lowered his rifle, his hands shaking with a fury he couldn't quite contain. He turned to Clara, his grey eyes burning with a fierce, absolute light. "They won't take you," he said, the words a vow. "I lost my family once. I won't lose it again." The psychological shift was complete. They were no longer a cook and her siblings living on a stranger's ranch. They were a family under siege, bound together by blood, biscuits, and a copper pot that had seen the death of one world and the birth of another. Clara looked at the horizon, where the mountains were turning purple in the twilight, and she knew that the real battle, the one for their souls and their freedom, was only just beginning. She would have to be more than a cook. She would have to be a soldier, and Stone Creek Ranch would have to be their fortress. By the time the moon rose over the valley, the kitchen quarters felt different, smaller but safer. Clara prepared a dinner of thick stew, her movements hurried as she tried to ignore the echo of Burke's voice in her head. The children were quiet, their brief joy in the meadow replaced by a renewed, sharp-edged fear. Tommy sat by the door, his hand on a heavy piece of wood, his young face etched with a grim determination. Even Lily seemed to understand that the world had grown dangerous again, clinging to Mercy's skirt as the older girl hummed a song about a bird that wouldn't sing. Clara looked at the copper pot, the light of the stove reflecting off its battered surface, and she felt the weight of her mother's legacy. Her mother had fought the fever, the hunger, and the land until she had nothing left but her breath. Clara would do the same. She thought of the sunshine to bread, and realized that sunshine was not just sweetness. It was the light that revealed the shadows and the heat that forged the steel. Zeke Mallister was their shield, but she was the heart of the fortress. As she served the bowls of stew, she looked at Sammy, who whispered Molly in his sleep, and she knew that no matter the cost, no matter the law, they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The third day ended with a prayer that was no longer a bargain, but a battle cry. The kitchen at Stone Creek Ranch before the crack of dawn was less a room and more a laboratory of survival, draped in the high-contrast shadows of a digital charcoal sketch. The air was a thick, frigid soup of coal dust and wood smoke that tasted like the grit of the Montana plains. Clara moved through this dim space like a ghost with a purpose, her hands finding the heavy cast-iron skillets by touch alone. The blood of this morning wasn't a fresh wound, but the memory of the deputy's skull cracking, a sound that still vibrated in her teeth every time she struck a match. She could see the dark stains on the copper pot's rim, even in the gloom, and she refused to scrub them away entirely. It was a reminder of the price of their safety. The stove, a black iron behemoth, groaned as she fed it cedar kindling, its belly roaring to life with a predatory hunger that mirrored her own. As the heat began to bleed into the room, Clara felt the tension in her neck ease just a fraction. She wasn't just making breakfast. She was forging a treaty with 17 men who viewed the world through the sights of a Winchester. Every measurement of flour, every pinch of salt was a tactical decision. If she failed to satisfy their bellies, she lost her leverage. In this dark psychological landscape, her utility was her only currency, and she intended to spend it wisely to buy her family another 24 hours of peace. The process of making the biscuits was a silent, sacred ritual, a mechanical meditation that Clara performed with the intensity of a surgeon. She began with the lard, cold, white, and unyielding, cutting it into the mountain of flour with her fingertips until the mixture achieved the consistency of coarse gravel. There was a science to it that her mother had taught her. If you let the lard melt before it hit the heat, the biscuit would be flat and soulless. It needed to remain in tiny, frozen pockets of fat that would explode into steam in the oven, creating the flaky layers that could make a grown man weep. She added the buttermilk, a sour, thick liquid that smelled of earth and hard work, and brought the dough together with a light touch. Overworking it was a death sentence. The gluten would toughen, and the resulting bread would be as hard as the granite peaks outside. As she rolled the dough onto the floured board, the sound was a soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that mimicked a heartbeat. She used a chipped tin cup to cut the circles, each one a perfect pale moon in the lantern light. These weren't just biscuits, they were small, edible promises of stability. In the stoic world of the American West, where words were sparse and emotions were buried under layers of leather and dirt, a perfectly risen biscuit was a communication more profound than any poem. As the first trays went into the oven, the sensory landscape of the kitchen shifted violently. The raw, dusty smell of flour was replaced by the intoxicating golden aroma of browning butter and toasted grain. This was the moment of the winning over. Clara could hear the men stirring in the bunkhouse across the yard, the low mumble of voices, the jangle of spurs, the rhythmic thud of boots hitting the porch. They were hungry, skeptical, and battle-hardened, yet they were susceptible to the primal pull of the hearth. She began the gravy next. A thick, pepper-flecked slurry birthed from the drippings of a dozen thick slices of salt pork. The grease hissed in the pan, a sharp, aggressive sound that demanded attention. She whisked in the flour until it turned the color of a wet buckskin, then added the milk, watching as the liquid transformed into a rich, creamy velvet. She added a double portion of black pepper, knowing that these men liked their food with a bite that matched the weather. The heat from the stove was now a physical presence, pressing against her chest and slicking her brow with sweat. By the time the back door creaked open to admit the first of the hands, the kitchen was a cathedral of steam and scent, a place where the darkness of their flight was temporarily held at bay by the sheer force of her labor. The men entered like a slow-moving tide of worn denim and weathered skin. Jonas led them, his face a map of 1,000 hard miles, but even his stoic mask cracked as the smell of the sage-infused gravy hit him. They didn't speak to Clara directly, not yet, but their eyes followed her movements with a new kind of intensity. It wasn't the suspicious gaze of a hunter looking at prey. It was the look of a man recognizing a vital resource. One hand, a massive man named Pete, with hands the size of dinner plates, hovered near the stove, his nostrils flared. Clara didn't shrink back. She stood her ground, the copper pot in her hand like a scepter. She filled their tin plates with a practiced efficiency, 2 biscuits apiece, smothered in gravy, topped with a slab of salt pork and a fried egg with a yolk as orange as the Montana sun. She watched them take their first bites, the psychological shift in the room almost palpable. The skepticism was replaced by a heavy, satisfied silence. This was the blood of the treaty, the exchange of her labor for their loyalty. As Pete took a second helping, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod in her direction. It was a small gesture, but in the hierarchy of Stone Creek, it was a declaration of protection. She was no longer just a stray, she was the one who fed the pack. Zeke Mallister didn't join the men at the communal table. He remained a silhouette in the hallway, a dark psychology of grief and duty. Clara could feel his presence before she saw him, a weight in the air that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. She prepared his tray with a different kind of focus, mindful of the sunshine honey she had used before. She wasn't just feeding him, she was attempting to bypass the granite walls he had built around his heart. She understood the stoicism of men like Zeke. It was a defense mechanism against a world that took everything you loved and laughed while doing it. When she brought the tray into his study, the room was cold, the fire in the hearth nothing but white ash. He looked at the biscuits, then at her, his smoke-grey eyes unreadable. "The men are talking," he said, his voice a low, dry rasp. "They say you cook like a woman twice your age." Clara didn't smile. "My mother didn't have the luxury of being young, and neither do I." Zeke went quiet, the words hanging between them like a bridge over a chasm. He took a bite of a biscuit, the flaky layers shattering against his thumb. He didn't offer a compliment, but he didn't dismiss her either. The silence was a mutual acknowledgement of the stakes. They were both broken vessels trying to hold water in a desert. Tommy and Mercy slipped into the kitchen as the men filed out, their movements still tentative, though the smell of the food had drawn them out of their shells. Tommy's role was evolving. He was no longer just a terrified boy, but Clara's apprentice in the art of the ranch. He carried the heavy water buckets and hauled the wood, his young muscles beginning to knot and harden under the weight of the work. He watched Clara with a mixture of awe and concern. "The men like you, Clara," he whispered as he stacked the wood by the stove. "I heard Pete say he'd break the jaw of anyone who spoke ill of the cook." Clara felt a surge of triumph, but she suppressed it. "Loyalty bought with food is only as good as the next meal, Tommy. We have to be consistent. We have to be indispensable." This was the core of her strategy, a dark, pragmatic realism. She was teaching Tommy that in this world, love was a luxury, but necessity was a shield. They were building a life on the edge of a blade, and every biscuit was a sharpening stone. Even Sammy seemed to sense the shift. He sat on a stool by the window, his eyes fixed on the stable where Molly was kept, a single biscuit clutched in his hand. He wasn't eating it. He was holding it like a talisman, a piece of the new world they were trying to build. Despite the morning's success, the shadow of Sheriff Burke flavored the breakfast like bitter dregs at the bottom of a coffee cup. Every time the wind rattled the windowpane, Clara's heart skipped a beat, her mind conjuring the image of Burke's oily smile and the glint of his badge. She knew the peace was an illusion, a temporary reprieve granted by the distance and Zeke's rifle. The psychological pressure was a constant hum in her ears, a reminder that they were still wanted, still hunted. She looked at her hands, reddened by the heat, dusted with flour, and still holding the ghost of the deputy's blood. She realized that she had crossed a line that she could never uncross. She was a 12-year-old girl who had committed an act of violence to save her family, and that violence had changed the chemistry of her soul. She wasn't a child anymore. She was a sovereign power of one, defending her borders with a copper pot and a rolling pin. As she began to scrub the breakfast pans, she felt a grim satisfaction. Let Burke come. Let the world try to take them. She had the men of Stone Creek in her corner, their bellies full of her salt and her sage, and she had Zeke Mallister's unspoken vow. She was the heart of the ranch now, and the heart did not stop beating without a fight. As the morning sun finally cleared the peaks, casting a harsh, uncompromising light over the ranch, the reality of their situation settled into a cold, hard truth. They were no longer running, but they were not yet free. The biscuits were gone, the gravy had cooled, and the long day of labor lay ahead. Clara watched from the kitchen porch as Zeke and the men mounted their horses, the dust rising in pale plumes behind them. She felt a strange sense of belonging, a connection to this unforgiving land that she hadn't expected. The ranch was a digital charcoal sketch of survival, stark, beautiful, and dangerous. She looked back into the kitchen, where her siblings were finally beginning to eat, their faces relaxed for the first time in weeks. She had won this morning. She had secured their position through the alchemy of the oven and the psychology of necessity. But as she gripped the handle of the copper pot, she knew that the real blood, the blood that would determine their ultimate fate, was still to come. The sheriff would not be satisfied with a bruised ego and a broken deputy. He would come for them with the full weight of the law, and when he did, Clara Ruth Whitfield would be waiting by her stove, her heart as hot as the coals and her resolve as cold as the mountain air. The 5th day at Stone Creek Ranch dawned with a sky the color of a bruised plum, the light filtering through the high Montana peaks in long, serrated blades of gold and gray. In the kitchen, the rhythm of survival continued, but the air felt charged with a different kind of electricity. Clara watched through the grime-streaked window as Sammy moved toward the stables. Since the moment he had laid eyes on Molly, the chestnut mare, the boy had become a creature of the barn, drawn to the animal with a magnetic pull that transcended his silence. There was a dark psychology to his attachment. Sammy, silenced by the trauma of abandonment, had found a mirror in a horse, silenced by the loss of her rider. Molly had been Emma's horse, a name that was still a jagged shard of glass in Zeke Mallister's throat. To see Sammy near the mare was to see a ghost haunting a living memory. Clara felt a tightening in her chest as she wiped the flour from her hands. She was watching a delicate bridge being built between two broken worlds, and she knew that if a single stone fell, the collapse would be catastrophic. The ranch was no longer just a place of labor. It was a sanctuary of echoes, where every creak of wood and every rustle of hay seemed to whisper the name of a girl who had perished in a fire 7 years ago. The stable was a cavern of amber light, and the sweet, heavy scent of alfalfa and weathered leather. Molly stood in her stall, her coat gleaming like a polished penny in the shafts of morning sun that pierced the cedar slats. She was a magnificent creature, bred for the high country, with a white blaze that looked like a lightning bolt frozen on her face. As Sammy approached, the mare lowered her head, her nostrils flaring as she took in the scent of the small boy. Sammy didn't hesitate. He moved with a supernatural calmness, his small hand reaching up to touch the velvet of her muzzle. There were no words, only the rhythmic sound of Molly's breathing and the soft scuff of Sammy's boots in the hay. Zeke stood in the shadows of the overhang, his large frame nearly invisible against the dark timber. He watched them with an expression that was a digital charcoal sketch of grief and longing. For 7 years, he had kept this stable closed, a tomb for a life he couldn't reclaim. Now, seeing Sammy's small fingers tangle in Molly's mane, the granite mask he wore was beginning to show the first hairline fractures. He wasn't just a rancher watching a boy, he was a father watching a resurrection. The lore of Emma Mallister was a ghost story that flavored the very water of the ranch. The ranch hands spoke of her in hushed tones, The girl who could outride any man on the spread, the girl who had her mother's eyes and her father's unyielding spirit. The fire that had claimed her and Mary Ellen had been a flash of absolute darkness that had extinguished the light of Stone Creek. Since then, Zeke had moved through the world like a man carved from ice, his heart a frozen wasteland where nothing grew. But as he watched Sammy, something changed. He stepped out of the shadows, his heavy boots silent on the straw. He didn't speak to the boy. Instead, he reached out and took a curry brush from the wall, offering it to Sammy with a gesture that was both a gift and a challenge. Sammy took the brush, his dark eyes meeting Zeke's smoke-grey ones in a silent exchange of understanding. The two of them began to groom the mare in a synchronized dance of non-verbal communication. Every stroke of the brush was a reclamation of the past, a way of tending to the wounds that time had failed to heal. Clara, watching from the kitchen porch, felt a lump form in her throat. They were two ghosts whispering to one another through the body of a horse, finding a language in the silence that words could never capture. The psychological breakthrough came as the sun reached its zenith, casting a harsh white light over the paddocks. Zeke had lifted Sammy onto Molly's back, his large hands supporting the boy with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his stature. They moved in a slow circle, the horse's hooves thudding softly on the earth. Sammy's face was transformed, the emptiness in his eyes replaced by a vibrant, shimmering wonder. He looked down at the mare, then up at Zeke, and then back at the house where Clara stood. His lips moved, a silent struggle behind his teeth, and then a sound emerged, a thin, rusty rasp that cut through the mountain air like a bell. "Molly," he said, the word a miracle birthed in the dust. "Pretty Molly." The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire ranch had held its breath. Clara fell to her knees on the porch, tears blurring her vision, while Tommy and Mercy stood frozen in the yard. Zeke went perfectly still, his hand trembling as it rested on Sammy's leg. It was a single word, but it was a declaration of return. The boy who had been stolen by grief had come back, led by the ghost of a girl he had never met. The dark psychology of the ranch had shifted. The tomb had become a home, and the echoes had finally found a voice. Zeke Mallister's reaction was not one of joy, but of a profound, shattering relief that looked like pain. He turned his head away, his shoulders shaking with a silent sob that he tried to bury in the crook of his arm. For a man who defined himself by his stoicism, this was a total surrender. He had spent 7 years believing that he was the only survivor of the fire, that the part of him capable of love had been reduced to ash. But as Sammy repeated the name, "Molly, Molly," Zeke realized that the fire hadn't taken everything. It had left him this girl, Clara, who fought like a wolf, and this boy, Sammy, who spoke to spirits. He reached up and lifted Sammy from the horse, holding the boy against his chest with a fierce, desperate intensity. Sammy didn't shrink away. He wrapped his small arms around Zeke's neck, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in the stable. The granite had finally cracked, and the man underneath was raw, bleeding, and alive. Clara watched them, her heart soaring even as she felt a new kind of fear. To love something was to give the world a weapon to use against you, and in the shadow of Sheriff Burke, love was the most dangerous gamble of all. Back in the kitchen, the mood had shifted from the grim labor of survival to a high-strung, hopeful energy. Tommy was whittling with a renewed vigor, his eyes bright as he looked at Clara. He talked, Clara. Sammy talked. The psychological impact on the other children was immediate. Mercy began to sing a song that wasn't about birds or mice, but about a mountain that moved to let the sun through. Even Lily seemed to sense the change, her cough subsiding as she played with a wooden horse Tommy had carved. Clara moved through the chores with a light heart, but her mind was already calculating the next move. She knew that healing was a slow process, and that Sammy's voice was only the beginning. She also knew that the sheriff wouldn't care about miracles. To Burke, Sammy was a bounty, and Stone Creek was a target. As she prepared the evening meal, a hearty beef stew with the last of the garden's carrots, she felt the weight of her responsibility grow. She had to protect this fragile piece. She had to ensure that the voice Sammy had found wasn't snatched away by the hand of the law. She looked at the copper pot, its surface reflecting the orange glow of the stove, and she made a silent vow to the ghost of her mother. She would walk through fire again if she had to, just to hear her brother say another word. The evening meal was a quiet affair, but the silence was no longer heavy with fear. It was thick with the weight of things unsaid but understood. Zeke sat at the head of the table, his eyes drifting toward Sammy more than once. He didn't speak of the miracle in the barn, but he gave the boy an extra helping of stew, a gesture that spoke volumes in the sparse language of the ranch. The ranch hands were quiet too, their respect for Clara growing with every meal, but tonight there was a new kind of reverence in the way they looked at the little cook. They had heard the news, the word had spread through the bunkhouse like wildfire, and they knew that something fundamental had changed on Stone Creek. They were no longer just a crew of hired hands, they were the guardians of a miracle. Pete, the massive hand with the dinner plate hands, caught Clara's eye and gave her a slow, deliberate wink. It was a sign of solidarity, a promise that they were in this together. The dark psychology of the fugitive was being replaced by the psychology of the family, and while that made them stronger, it also made the stakes higher than they had ever been. As the moon rose over the valley, casting the ranch in a light of light sepia and cinematic shadow, Clara stood on the porch, breathing in the cold mountain air. She thought about the ghost's whisper, the way Emma's memory had reached out through a chestnut horse to pull her brother back from the brink. She realized that the ranch was a living, breathing entity, a collection of scars and stories that were now intertwined with her own. She looked at the mountains, their peaks white and silent in the moonlight, and she felt a sense of belonging that terrified her. She was no longer just a girl running away, she was a girl who had found something worth staying for. But in the distance, she could see the faint, rhythmic flicker of lights moving along the valley floor. Riders. Burke was coming back, or perhaps he had never really left. The psychological warfare was entering a new phase, and the miracle of Sammy's voice would soon be tested against the cold reality of lead and iron. Clara gripped the handle of the copper pot, the metal cold against her palm, and she waited for the darkness to break. The sixth morning at Stone Creek Ranch did not break with the soft promise of light. It arrived with a low, rhythmic thrumming of earth that vibrated through the floorboards of the kitchen quarters. Clara, already at the stove, felt it in the soles of her feet before she heard the jangle of metal or the snort of a horse. It was the sound of authority, unearned, corrupt, and heavy. She looked at Tommy, whose face had gone a chalky, translucent white, his knuckles turning into pale stones as he gripped the edge of the table. The miracle of Sammy's voice from the day before felt suddenly like a fragile glass ornament in the path of a stampede. In the high-contrast shadows of the early light, the ranch took on the look of a digital charcoal sketch, where the blacks were deep and ink-like, and the greys were as cold as mountain flint. Clara reached for the copper pot, her fingers finding the familiar dents. She didn't hide it this time. She held it by the handle, the weight of it a grounding force against the panic rising in her throat. She could see them through the grime-streaked window. 4 riders, their silhouettes cut sharp against the light sepia sky. At the head was Sheriff Thaddeus Burke, his badge catching a stray glint of the sun like a predatory eye. This was the psychological weight of the law, not a shield to protect, but a hammer to break. Sheriff Burke didn't dismount immediately. He sat atop his black gelding, a man who understood the theater of power. He looked down at the ranch with a proprietary air, his oily smile barely visible beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. To his left was Mrs. Ashworth, her back as straight as a tombstone, her eyes scanning the outbuildings for the cargo she had come to claim. There is a specific kind of dark psychology employed by men like Burke. They do not begin with violence, but with the threat of it, wrapped in the silk of legality. He leaned forward, resting his gloved hands on the pommel of his saddle. "Zeke," his voice rang out, a smooth, practiced drawl that carried the chill of a winter ravine. "I know you're awake, Mallister. No sense in making the lady wait in the cold. We have papers to serve, and a debt to the territory to collect." Clara watched Zeke emerge from the main house. He didn't carry his rifle this time, but his presence was a physical barricade. He moved with the slow, deliberate lethality of a landslide, stopping at the edge of the porch. The air between the two men grew thick, charged with the ozone of impending thunder. It was a confrontation of 2 different kinds of silence, Zeke's, which was the silence of a mountain, and Burke's, which was the silence of a grave. The legal argument was a blunt instrument. Burke reached into his coat and produced a folded parchment, the seal of the territory red and wet-looking in the morning light. Judge Morrison doesn't take kindly to his orders being ignored, Zeke. These children are fugitives. The girl is wanted for the assault, potentially the murder of a deputy. And the younger ones? They belong to the Helena Orphan Asylum by right of the state. You're harboring stolen property. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. To Burke, they weren't people. They were property, ledger entries in a corrupt system of bounties and labor. Mrs. Ashworth spoke then, her voice a thin, dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering over a sidewalk. Mr. Mallister, you are a man of solitude. You have no wife, no standing in the community of parents. You are an unfit guardian for souls that require the firm hand of Christian discipline. We are here to provide them with the structure they lack. Stand aside, or the law will move you. This was the crux of the dark psychology. The attempt to make Zeke feel small, isolated, and legally impotent. They were trying to convince him that his grief made him a criminal, and that his protection was a sin. Zeke didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the papers. He kept his eyes on Burke, his gaze as steady as a predator's. "I told you once, Burke," Zeke said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to come from the very earth beneath his boots. "These children are mine. I've filed for adoption in the county seat. The papers are already in motion." This was a lie, a strategic, desperate gamble. But he said it with such absolute conviction that even Burke's oily smile flickered for a second. "Adoption?" Burke laughed, a sound like dry bones rattling in a bag. "A hermit like you. No judge is going to give 5 children to a man who talks to ghosts. You think a few weeks of biscuits and a warm bed erases the fact that the girl nearly killed a man? Horace is lying in a bed in Willow Springs, unable to feed himself because of her. That's a hanging offense, Zeke. If you don't turn them over, I'll bring a posse back here that'll burn this spread to the ground just to find them." The psychological stakes had shifted from legal theater to a threat of total annihilation. Clara felt Sammy's small hand slip into hers, his fingers trembling. He hadn't spoken since the miracle in the stable, but his presence was a silent plea for her to do something. Clara stepped out of the kitchen then, the copper pot gripped in her hand, the sunlight glinting off its battered copper surface. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a consequence. "Horace tried to touch my sister," she said, her voice ringing out across the yard with a clarity that made the riders shift in their saddles. "He threw my brother to the dirt. I didn't mean to kill him, but I meant to stop him. And I'll stop you too, Sheriff. I don't care about your papers, I care about my family." Burke looked at her, and for the first time the amusement left his eyes. He saw the same thing Zeke had seen, the unyielding dark fire of a survivor. There is a point where fear turns into a cold, hard resolve, and Clara had reached it long ago. Burke signaled to his deputies, their hands moving toward their holsters, but before they could draw, the rhythmic clack-clack of Winchester rifles echoed from the bunkhouse and the loft of the barn. Jonas and the ranch hands had appeared, their rifles leveled at the riders. The little cook had bought more than just their bellies. She had bought their loyalty, and they were ready to pay for it in lead. "The law is a fine thing when it's used for justice, Burke," Jonas called out from the shadows of the barn. "But when it's used to steal children, it's just a dirty rag. We like the way the girl cooks. We like the way the boy rides. And we don't like you. Now I suggest you turn those horses around before someone's finger gets a cramp." The standoff was a cinematic moment of absolute tension, the digital charcoal sketch of the ranch frozen in a state of potential violence. Burke looked at the rifles, then at Zeke, then at Clara. He knew he couldn't win a shootout here, not with 17 men holding the high ground, but the dark psychology of the corrupt is that they never truly retreat, they merely pivot. "This isn't over, Zeke," Burke said, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You think you can fight the whole territory? You think those hands will stay loyal when the bounties start hitting the telegraph? I'll be back, and next time I won't come with papers. I'll come with fire." He wheeled his horse around, the gravel spitting from beneath the hooves as he and his deputies galloped away. Mrs. Ashworth didn't look back, but the way she sat her horse suggested she was already planning her next move. As the dust settled, the silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of a battlefield between skirmishes. Zeke turned to Clara, his face a mask of exhaustion and grim determination. He didn't offer a smile or a word of comfort. He simply looked at the copper pot in her hand and gave a curt nod. "Go back inside," he said. "Feed the children. Jonas, I want guards on the perimeter, night and day. No one gets on this land without a name and a reason. The psychological toll was visible in the way the men moved, hurried, alert, their eyes scanning the tree line. The ranch had been a sanctuary. Now it was a fortress under siege. Clara returned to the kitchen, but she didn't put the pot away. She set it on the stove, a silent reminder that the war had moved from the shadows into the light. She looked at her siblings, Tommy, Mercy, Sammy, and Lily, and realized that their childhood was being consumed by this conflict. They were becoming hard, quiet, and watchful. This was the dark reality of their existence. They were wanted, and until they could break the law that hunted them, they would never truly be home. As she began to prepare the midday meal, her mind was already racing. Burke wouldn't wait long. He was a man of ego, and a man of ego cannot handle being humiliated by a girl and a hermit. She knew they needed a plan that went beyond rifles and walls. They needed to attack the source of Burke's power, his legality. She thought about the asylum and the way Mrs. Ashworth had looked at the children. There was a business there, a dark trade in souls that masked itself as charity. If she could find proof of that trade, if she could expose the corruption that fueled Burke's badge, they might have a chance. She looked at the copper pot and realized that it had one more job to do. It had been a tool for feeding and a weapon for defending. Now it would have to be the vessel for their liberation. She felt a cold, sharp focus settle over her. She was no longer just the girl who had run. She was the girl who was going to finish this. The sixth day ended with the ranch bathed in a light sepia glow, the sun setting behind the mountains in a burst of red and gold that looked like blood on the snow. The psychological atmosphere was one of high-strung readiness. Every snap of a twig was a potential scout. Every shadow was a potential deputy. Zeke sat on the porch, his rifle across his knees, a silent guardian of the world he had rediscovered. Clara watched him from the kitchen window, feeling a deep, unspoken bond with this man who had chosen to stand in the fire with them. They were a family of scars, but as she hummed a song to Lily, she knew that they were stronger than the law that tried to break them. The battle was coming, and when it did, the heart of Stone Creek would not be found in the rifles or the walls, but in the heat of the stove and the weight of the copper pot. The seventh night at Stone Creek Ranch arrived with a silence that was too heavy, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like a predator holding its breath. For 3 weeks, the ranch had existed in a state of hypervigilance, a digital charcoal sketch of tension where every rustle of the high grass was a potential threat. The air had turned colder, a sharp, crystalline frost beginning to coat the timber, but the real chill came from the psychological weight of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sheriff Burke had not been seen, but his absence was its own kind of presence, a dark, looming shadow that flavored the water and the bread. Clara felt it in her bones as she prepared the evening meal. The sunshine she had tried to bake into her biscuits felt dim against the encroaching gloom. The ranch was a fortress, yes, but even the strongest fortress is vulnerable to a spark. It began not with a bang, but with a disappearance. 30 head of cattle from the north pasture vanished like smoke in the wind. This was the first move in a dark psychological game, a classic diversion designed to pull the teeth from the wolf so the sheep could be slaughtered. The news of the rustling hit the ranch like a physical blow. Jonas had returned from the perimeter with a face as grim as a winter sky, his report short and jagged. 30 head, boss. Cut clean from the herd under the cover of the midnight fog. They're heading toward the ravines. Zeke Mallister didn't hesitate. A rancher's life is his livestock, and to lose 30 head was to lose the lifeblood of Stone Creek. He assembled a posse of his 12 best men, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange light of the lanterns as they checked their cinches and checked their rifles. The cinematic quality of the departure was undeniable, the steam rising from the horses' nostrils, the jangle of spurs, the rhythmic thud of hooves against the hardening earth. Zeke looked at Clara from atop his grey stallion, his smoke-grey eyes filled with a conflict he couldn't voice. "Keep the doors locked," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. "Jonas is staying with 4 men. If you see a light that shouldn't be there, you head for the root cellar. Understand?" Clara nodded, her hand gripping the handle of the copper pot, feeling a sudden, sharp spike of intuition that this was exactly what Burke wanted. As the posse rode out, disappearing into the black moor of the timberline, the ranch felt hollowed out, its strength halved, and its spirit stretched thin. Clara retreated to the kitchen, but she didn't sleep. She sat by the stove, the embers glowing like a dying sun, and she listened to the world. The silence was absolute, yet it was a loud silence, thick with the sound of things that weren't happening. She thought about the dark psychology of a man like Burke. He was a coward who hid behind a badge, a man who wouldn't fight a mountain like Zeke head-on if he could set a trap in the dark instead. She looked at Tommy, who was asleep on a bed of hay by the door, his hand still clutching the wooden carving he had been working on. He looked so small in the shadows, a reminder of why they were here and what they had to lose. Every creak of the house, every groan of the settling wood felt like a footstep. She realized then that the law they were fighting wasn't just a set of rules, it was a predatory force that used the very landscape as a weapon. It happened at 3 in the morning, the hour when the soul is most vulnerable and the world is at its darkest. The smell arrived first, not the sweet, earthy scent of wood smoke, but the sharp, aggressive and chemical odor of kerosene. It cut through the cold air like a knife, a visceral warning that made Clara's eyes snap open. She didn't wait to hear the roar. She was already on her feet, grabbing Tommy by the shoulder and shaking him awake. "The cellar! Get the girls to the cellar now!" The first flame sprouted from the back of the main barn, a small, flicking tongue of orange that quickly grew into a roaring beast. The dry cedar of the barn, seasoned by years of mountain sun, was the perfect fuel. Within minutes, the structure was a glistening inferno, the light of the fire turning the night into a terrifying high-contrast landscape of orange and black. The psychological impact was immediate, a sense of absolute powerlessness against a force that sought only to consume. The ranch erupted into chaos. Jonas and the 4 remaining hands were already out, their shouts lost in the deafening crackle of the flames. Clara ran into the yard, her shawl pulled tight over her face to filter the thickening smoke. The heat was a physical wall, a solid pressure that scorched the hair on her arms and stole the moisture from her throat. She could see the historical realism of the tragedy unfolding. Men with buckets, a frantic and futile attempt to fight a mountain of fire with thimbles of water. But then a sound cut through the roar of the blaze, a sound that made Clara's heart stop, the terrified, high-pitched whinny of a horse. Molly. The chestnut mare was still in her stall, the very stall that was now being licked by the reaching fingers of the fire. Sammy's horse. Emma's legacy. The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. If Molly died, the fragile bridge they had built to Sammy's soul would burn with her. Without a second thought, Clara plunged toward the stable. "Clara! No!" Jonas's voice was a distant rasp, but she didn't listen. She was moving on pure, primal instinct, the copper pot still in her hand, as if it were a talisman of protection. The smoke inside the stable was a thick, black velvet that blinded her and burned her lungs. She couldn't see, but she could hear the frantic kicking of hooves against wood, the rhythmic, panicked breath of a creature that knew it was dying. She found Molly's stall by touch, the wood already hot to the touch. The mare was rearing, her eyes wide and rolling in the orange light. "Easy, girl! Easy!" Clara's voice was lost in the roar, but she fumbled with the latch, her fingers blistering as she fought the metal. The door swung open, and for a second, the horse and the girl were locked in a psychological standoff. Then, Molly bolted, a chestnut streak of desperation that nearly knocked Clara over as she thundered toward the exit and out into the night. Clara tried to follow, but the smoke had claimed her. She fell to her knees, the floorboards beneath her beginning to groan with the weight of the collapsing roof. She felt a strange, detached calmness, a dark psychological acceptance that this was the end of her story. She thought of her mother, of the biscuits and the honey, and she hoped that Tommy would remember how to knead the dough. Then the world changed. Strong, calloused hands grabbed her by the shoulders, lifting her with a strength that felt like the mountain itself. She was carried out of the barn just as the main timber gave way, a shower of sparks rising into the sky like 1,000 angry stars. She blinked her eyes open and saw Zeke's face. Not the granite mask he usually wore, but a face twisted with a terror so profound it was unrecognizable. He had returned, the rustlers forgotten as soon as the glow on the horizon had signaled the attack on his heart. Zeke didn't look at the burning barn. He didn't look at the horses or the men. He looked at Clara, his breath coming in ragged gasps that sounded like a wounded animal. "You went back in," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You could have died for a horse." Clara looked at him, her face smeared with soot, her hair singed at the edges. "I couldn't let Sammy lose her, Papa. I couldn't let you lose her." The word Papa hung in the air, a cinematic punctuation to the tragedy. Zeke pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace, his large frame shaking with a silent, shattering sob. He had lost his first family to a fire just like this, and for a terrifying hour he had believed history was repeating itself. But Clara had fought the fire and won. She had saved the ghost of his daughter and the voice of her brother. The psychological bond between them was no longer just a contract of convenience. It was a covenant forged in the furnace. As the sun began to rise, a cold, grey light that revealed the smouldering ruins of the barn, the full extent of the dark realism became clear. The main hay store was gone. 3 of the ranch's best horses lay dead in the ruins. The ranch was crippled, its winter survival now a desperate question. But as they searched the grounds, Jonas found the final cutting blow, a kerosene can discarded near the fence and a piece of paper, singed at the edges but perfectly legible. It was a note, written in a hand that was as oily as the man who had sent it. Clara stood by Zeke's side as he read the note. The fire in the barn was out, but a new fire was beginning to burn in the yard, a fire of absolute, unyielding resolve. Zeke didn't shout, he didn't curse. He simply folded the note and tucked it into his pocket, his eyes turning back into the cold, grey flint of a mountain peak. "He wants a war," Zeke said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Then we'll give him one, but we won't fight on his terms anymore." The psychological atmosphere of the ranch shifted from defense to offensive. They were no longer the hunted, they were the hunters. Clara looked at the copper pot, now blackened by the soot of the barn, and she felt a grim satisfaction. The sheriff thought he could break them with fire, but he didn't understand that fire only makes steel stronger. The children emerged from the cellar, their faces pale but their eyes bright with the relief of seeing Clara alive. Sammy ran to Molly, who was standing by the creek, her chestnut coat covered in ash, but her spirit unbroken. The boy didn't speak, but he leaned his head against the mare's neck, a silent acknowledgement of the life that had been saved. Clara watched them and knew that the dark psychology of fear had lost its power over her. She was no longer afraid of Burke. She was only afraid of what she would have to become to stop him. As she began to plan the next move, the investigation into the orphanage, the hunt for the papers, she felt a cold, sharp focus settle over her. The Copper Covenant was no longer a promise of survival, it was a promise of justice. The morning after the fire, Stone Creek Ranch looked like a digital charcoal sketch rendered in the cruelest shades of ash and bone. The air was a heavy, stagnant soup of charred cedar and the metallic tang of extinguished hope. Clara stood by the smouldering ruins of the main barn, her feet rooted in the blackened earth, her copper pot clutched so tightly her knuckles were white as the mountain snow. The fire had been a message, but as she watched the smoke curl into a pale Montana sky, her fear had solidified into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. They were no longer just survivors, they were combatants. Zeke Mallister moved beside her, his presence a dark pillar of silent fury. He didn't need to speak. The way he looked at the singed note in his hand said everything. Defense was a luxury they could no longer afford. To save the children, they had to dismantle the man who claimed to be the law. They needed more than rifles. They needed the truth, documented and undeniable. The psychological shift was absolute. Clara realized that while Burke had the badge, he was fueled by a secret economy, a trade in human lives that left a trail of ink and blood. If they could follow that ink, they could find the rope to hang him. The decision was made in the silence of the ruins. They were going to find the papers that turned children into currency. The investigation began with Widow Harrison, a woman whose respectable veneer in town masked a spine of forged steel and a network of whispers that reached deep into the territory's dark corners. She arrived at the ranch in a buggy that smelled of peppermint and old secrets, her eyes sharp as a hawk's as she surveyed the damage. "Burke is a man of appetite," she said, her voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of decades. but appetite requires a kitchen. The Helena Orphan Asylum isn't a charity, Clara, it's a clearinghouse. Through the widow's connections, the lore of Mrs. Prudence Ashworth began to emerge in high contrast detail. The asylum was a fortress of Victorian discipline, a grand, intimidating structure designed to make children feel small and the state feel powerful. But beneath the prayers and the starched collars was a ledger of disappearances. The wards didn't just move on to better lives, they were funneled into the dark maw of the territory's industrial machine. The psychological horror of the scheme was its legality. Burke signed the papers, Ashworth processed the bodies, and the mines and factories paid the difference. It was a closed loop of human misery, and the evidence was locked behind the asylum's iron-gated doors. The paper trail led them to Rebecca, a young nurse at the asylum who still had a conscience that hadn't been scoured away by Mrs. Ashworth's lye soap. Meeting her was a high-stakes psychological game. She was terrified, her hands trembling as she sat across from Clara and the widow in the back room of a quiet boarding house. "The ledgers," Rebecca whispered, her eyes darting toward the door as if Ashworth's ghost were listening. "They aren't kept in the public office. They're in the safe in her private study. Every name, every transfer fee, every signature from the sheriff." She spoke of the children not as names, but as numbers. Number 42, shipped to the Holbrook mine. Number 15, sent to the garment factory in the east. The dark realism of the situation was staggering. This wasn't just corruption, it was a system of modern-day slavery operating under the cover of the law. To get those papers meant a level of risk that made the barn fire look like a campfire. It required a mole, a thief, and a miracle. Rebecca agreed to help, not for money, but for the memory of a boy named Silas who had died in a cold dormitory after Ashworth refused him a doctor. The hunt for the documents became a countdown, each day bringing Burke closer to another collection and another fire. When the copies of the ledgers were finally smuggled out, the psychological impact on the ranch was profound. Clara spread the papers across the heavy oak table in the main house, the light sepia tones of the old ink revealing a decade of organized cruelty. There were 60 names, 60 children who had been processed like cattle through the Helena Orphan Asylum. Clara's finger traced the names, her breath hitching as she saw how close her own siblings had come to being just another number on the list. Tommy, Mercy, Sammy, Lily, their names had likely been drafted in a similar ledger in Burke's mind. The digital charcoal starkness of the signatures was the most damning part. Sheriff Thaddeus Burke's flourishing script was scrawled at the bottom of every work placement order. The fees were listed with a cold, businesslike precision. $20 for a healthy boy, $15 for a girl. It was the bounty on their heads, the reason Burke was so set on reclaiming the Whitfield orphans. He hadn't lost just a deputy, he had lost a payday. The realization made Clara's stomach turn, a visceral revulsion that fueled her focus. They had the proof, but proof in the hands of a fugitive was just a death warrant. They needed to get this to someone Burke couldn't buy, the federal marshal in Helena. The psychological lore of the asylum deepened as they cross-referenced the names with local rumors. Clara spent nights by the lantern light, mapping out the fates of the lost 60. It was a dark psychology of geography. The children were scattered across the territory, sent to places where no one would ask questions and no one would hear them cry. The historical realism of the child labor system in the 1870s was a landscape of coal dust, spinning jennies, and early graves. Zeke watched her work, his silence a heavy, protective blanket. He saw the way the names haunted her, the way she was carrying the weight of 60 ghosts on her 12-year-old shoulders. "You're doing more than just protecting your own now, Clara," he said one night, his voice a low, gritty rumble. "You're fighting for every child who didn't have a sister like you." The bond between them tightened with every page they turned. They were no longer just a rancher and his cook. They were the custodians of a terrible truth. The paper trail was more than a weapon. It was a memorial to the children Burke and Ashworth had tried to erase from history. The final piece of the puzzle was the connection to the territory's judicial system. The ledgers revealed that a local judge, Judge Morrison, was also receiving a processing fee for every adoption he denied and every ward he signed over to the asylum. The corruption was a three-headed hydra: the badge, the gavel, and the ledger. This was the psychological barrier they had to overcome. How do you fight a system where every door of justice is guarded by a man with a price? Clara realized that a direct confrontation in Willow Springs would be a massacre. Burke controlled the town, the judge controlled the court, and Ashworth controlled the orphans. Their only hope lay in the federal marshal, William Thornton, a man whose reputation for honesty was a light in the dark, sepia world of the territory. But to reach him, Clara would have to leave the safety of Stone Creek. She would have to ride through the night, past Burke's scouts and through the lawless ravines, carrying the paper trail that could burn the whole system down. The investigation was over. The mission was about to begin. As the sun set on the 8th day, casting long, cinematic shadows across the ranch, Clara packed the ledgers into a waterproof oilskin bag. She looked at the copper pot on the stove, its blackened surface a testament to the fire she had already survived. She felt a strange, detached calmness, the dark psychology of the soldier. She wasn't afraid of the ride, she was afraid of what would happen if she failed. The children were asleep in the back room, their breathing a rhythmic, soft reminder of the stakes. Sammy had whispered Molly in his sleep, a small victory that seemed huge in the face of the coming storm. Zeke stood on the porch, his rifle a silent promise of defense, but his eyes were on Clara. He knew what she was asking to do. He knew the risk. The ranch was a fortress, but a fortress that is only defended is eventually taken. They had the paper trail, and tonight Clara would become the wind that carried the fire to the sheriff's door. The 9th night at Stone Creek Ranch began with a sky so thick with clouds it looked like a digital charcoal sketch where the artist had forgotten the light. The air was a razor, sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and the lingering bitter ash of the barn. Clara stood in the kitchen, the oilskin bag of ledgers strapped tight across her chest like a second heart. Every beat of her pulse felt like it was hammering against the signatures of 60 stolen children. This was the psychological pivot, the transition from the girl who defends to the girl who attacks. She wasn't just riding for the marshal, she was riding to outrun the version of herself that could still feel fear. Zeke stood by her side, his large hand resting on her shoulder. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her to be careful. He knew that careful was a luxury she'd spent long ago. He simply looked at her, his smoke-grey eyes reflecting a cinematic mixture of pride and terror. He was a man who had lost his world once, and he was watching his second one gallop toward a potential gallows. The mission was clear: reach the Silver Star Inn in Helena, find Marshal William Thornton, and deliver the fire that would burn the sheriff's house down. Clara didn't leave from the main gate. That was the first lesson of dark psychological warfare. Never go where you are expected. She led her horse, a sturdy, dark bay named Cinder, who moved like a shadow, through the rear pasture and into the timberline. The trees were ancient, silent witnesses to her flight, their branches clawing at the night sky like the ribs of a giant. She looked back once at the ranch. The house was a dim, golden ember in the darkness, a sanctuary she might never see again. Tommy was there, guarding the others with a stick and a vow. Sammy was there, whispering to Molly in the dark. Lily and Mercy were there, wrapped in the safety of a dream she had bought with blood. The historical realism of the ride was immediate. The saddle leather creaked under her weight, the horse's breath was a rhythmic plume of steam, and the ground was a treacherous maze of frost-slicked roots. She felt small, a 12-year-old girl, lost in a million acres of Montana wilderness, but the weight of the copper pot on her saddle horn was a grounding force. She wasn't just a rider, she was a vessel for justice. The first 3 miles were a game of ghosts. Clara kept off the main trails, following the narrow, winding deer paths that threaded through the ravines. She moved with a silent, focused intensity, her ears tuned to the world. There is a specific kind of dark psychology that takes hold when you are being hunted in the dark. Every snap of a twig sounds like a hammer cocking, and every shadow looks like a man on a black horse. She thought of Sheriff Burke, his oily smile, his cold eyes, his belief that she was just a litter of an orphan. He underestimated her, and that was her greatest weapon. She pushed Cinder harder as they hit the high ridge, the wind screaming through the rocks with a sound like 1,000 voices. She was halfway to the fork in the road when she heard the sound she'd been dreading, the rhythmic, heavy thud of multiple hooves behind her. Not ranch horses. These were riders who knew the terrain, riders who were gaining. The chase was a high-octane sequence of cinematic tension. Clara veered Cinder down a steep embankment, the horse's hooves sliding over the loose shale with a sound like grinding teeth. Behind her, she saw the flicker of torchlight through the timber. 3 riders, maybe 4. Burke's scouts. They didn't shout, they didn't call out. They simply hunted. The psychological pressure was a physical weight on her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. She plunged into the wash of a dry creek bed, the darkness here so absolute she had to trust the horse's instincts over her own eyes. The digital charcoal landscape of the ravine was a blur of black and grey, a tunnel of limestone and spruce that seemed to have no end. She could feel the rider's presence behind her, a cold, predatory heat that was closing the gap. She wasn't just riding for her life. She was riding for the 60 names in her bag. If she fell, the children of the territory would fall with her. She reached the white stone crossing just as the moon broke through the clouds, casting a harsh, pale light over the landscape. The water was hip-deep and moving fast, the current a churning mass of silver and ink. Clara spurred Cinder into the river, the horse neighing in protest as the icy water hit its belly. She could hear the riders now, their shouts carrying over the roar of the water. "There, by the bank! Don't let her cross!" A gunshot echoed through the ravine, the lead whistling past her ear and splashing into the water with a sharp zip. Clara didn't look back. She leaned low over Cinder's neck, her heart hammering in time with the horse's labouring pulse. "Come on, girl," she whispered, her voice a rasp of desperation. "Just a little further, just to the trees." They hit the far bank, Cinder's hooves scrambling for purchase on the slick mud, and plunged back into the safety of the timber just as a second shot shattered a nearby branch. The ride became a blur of pain and exhaustion as the hours stretched toward dawn. Clara's legs were numb from the cold, her fingers frozen into claws around the reins. Every muscle in her body screamed, a visceral symphony of fatigue that threatened to pull her from the saddle. But whenever her mind drifted toward surrender, she thought of Sammy's voice. She thought of the way he'd said, "Molly," a miracle that had survived the fire and the sheriff. She thought of Zeke, sitting on the porch with his rifle, waiting for a girl who had become his daughter. The dark psychology of the ride had shifted from escape to deliverance. She wasn't running from Burke, she was running to the truth. The sun began to bleed over the eastern peaks, a pale sepia light that revealed the distant wooden silhouettes of Helena's rooftops. She had made it. She was a ragged, soot-stained ghost of a girl on a lathered horse, but she was still carrying the fire. Clara entered Helena as the first delivery wagons were beginning to rattle down the cobblestone streets. The town was a historical realism portrait of industry. The smell of coal smoke, the sound of waking bells, the sight of men in bowler hats heading for the mines. She looked out of place, a digital charcoal figure in a world that was trying to be modern and clean. She found the Silver Star Inn on the main street, a 2-story brick building that looked solid and unyielding. She didn't dismount gracefully. She slid from the saddle, her legs buckling as her boots hit the ground. Her ankle, twisted in the barn fire, flared with a white-hot agony that made the world spin. She didn't care. She limped toward the door, the oilskin bag clutched against her chest like a shield. The clerk at the front desk looked at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion, a dirty girl in boy's clothes covered in trail dust and soot. "I need to see Marshal William Thornton," she said, her voice a jagged rasp that brooked no argument. The clerk started to sputter a refusal, but Clara didn't wait. She pulled a single page from the oilskin bag, a page with Sheriff Burke's signature next to a child's price, and slapped it on the counter. "Tell him Clara Whitfield is here. Tell him I have the names of 60 children he's been looking for." The psychological effect was instantaneous. The clerk's face went from annoyance to a pale, wide-eyed shock. He didn't say another word, he simply turned and ran for the back stairs. Clara sank into a nearby chair, her body finally giving up the fight. She closed her eyes and felt the weight of the copper pot on her saddle outside, the weight of the ledgers on her lap, and the weight of the promise she had kept. The marshal arrived 2 minutes later, a man with silver hair and eyes that looked like they had seen the very bottom of the human soul. He looked at the paper on the desk, then at the ragged girl in the chair. He didn't ask for her story. He could read it in the soot on her face and the fire that still burned in her eyes. "You're Mallister's girl," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble of authority. Clara looked up, her vision blurring with a sudden, overwhelming relief. "I'm Clara Whitfield," she whispered, "and I've brought you the truth." The ride was over, the papers were delivered, and the marshal was already reaching for his gun belt. The dark psychology of the law was about to turn on the man who had worn it as a mask. Marshal Thornton did not move for a long time after the final page of the ledger was turned. The silence in his office was thick, weighted by the documented sins of 60 children whose lives had been reduced to ink and commerce. To a man of the law, signatures are sacred. They are the physical binding of a person's word to the world. Seeing Sheriff Thaddeus Burke's name scrawled next to transfer fee $20 was a betrayal of the very badge Thornton had worn for 30 years. The digital charcoal sketch of the room was stark. The marshal stood against the window, the morning light casting long skeletal shadows across the evidence. His jaw was set like a vice, the psychological shift from observation to execution complete. He looked at Clara, seeing not a girl, but a survivor of a war he hadn't known was being waged. "This isn't just a crime, Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice a low, vibrating chord of controlled rage. "This is an infection, and the only way to treat an infection is to cut it out at the root." He turned to his deputy with a gaze that could wither timber. "Gather the men. We ride for the asylum first. I want every child accounted for before the sheriff realizes his shadow has been caught." Clara felt the world tilt as the adrenaline finally vacated her system, leaving behind a hollow ache that reached into her very marrow. She was a visceral portrait of exhaustion, her clothes a tapestry of soot, dried blood, and trail dust. Every time she blinked, the image of the burning barn flashed behind her eyelids, an orange and black nightmare that refused to cool. Mrs. Thornton, the marshal's wife, appeared at the door, her presence a soft sepia contrast to the hard iron of the office. She guided Clara to a room upstairs, her hands gentle as they unbuckled the oilskin bag. The psychological release was violent. Clara didn't cry, but her body shook with a rhythmic, soundless tremor. She watched as they laid out the papers on a clean white bedspread, the contrast between the pristine fabric and the dirty records of human misery almost unbearable. She thought of Tommy and Sammy, still at Stone Creek, and wondered if they were looking at the same sun she was. She had delivered the fire, but she wasn't yet warm. The historical realism of her state was a reminder that courage is not a bottomless well. It is a loan taken from the future, and the bill was coming due. The marshal's posse was not a mere collection of deputies. It was a hammer forged of seasoned lawmen and federal authority. They moved through the streets of Helena with a cinematic gravity, their horses' hooves a rhythmic, metallic drumbeat against the cobblestones. There were no shouts, no fanfares, only the cold, professional intent of men who had been given a target. Thornton led them, his silver hair a banner in the wind, his badge a cold star of retribution. As they crested the hill toward the Helena Orphan Asylum, the structure loomed like a Victorian fortress of industry and despair. It was a grey, four-story monolith of limestone and iron, its windows like narrow, judgmental eyes. The dark psychology of the architecture was intentional. It was designed to overwhelm the smallness of a child and project the absolute authority of the institution. Thornton raised his hand, the posse fanning out to surround the gates. The law was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical presence, unyielding and armed, demanding entry into a place where mercy had long since been evicted. Inside the asylum, the air was a stale mixture of lye soap, thin cabbage soup, and a silence that felt heavy and artificial. Mrs. Ashworth stood behind her massive oak desk, her face a mask of starched indignation. "Marshal Thornton," she said, her voice a thin, dry reed of a sound. "This is a house of God and the state. You have no cause to disturb the discipline of these unfortunate souls." The psychological standoff was a clash of two different versions of the West, the one that hid its cruelty behind discipline, and the one that demanded accountability. Thornton didn't offer a polite rebuttal. He dropped a copy of the ledger onto her desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sterile room. "The discipline of $20 a head, Mrs. Ashworth?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Your ledger is a map of graves and factories. I suggest you tell me where the last shipment went, or your next residence will have bars on the windows." The digital charcoal starkness of her reaction was visible, the way her throat tightened, the way her eyes darted toward the safe. She was no longer a superintendent. She was a cornered animal, realizing that the paper trail she had so meticulously kept was now the rope she would hang by. While Thornton confronted the head of the institution, his deputies moved through the lower levels, uncovering the dark realism of the asylum's hidden life. They found the workrooms, cramped windowless spaces where children no older than Sammy stood over spinning jennies and sewing machines, their hands calloused and their eyes hollowed by the lack of sun. The air here was a thick, humid fog of dust and sweat, a sensory portrait of human industry at its most predatory. There were no toys, no books, only the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of machinery and the watchful gaze of overseers who fled at the sight of federal badges. The psychological impact on the deputies was profound. These were hardened men who had faced outlaws and rustlers, yet they stood paralyzed by the sight of 60 small lives being consumed by the clock. They began to lead the children out, a procession of ghosts blinking in the sudden, blinding light of the hallway. This was the blood of the justice, not the death of a man, but the reclamation of a childhood that had been stolen and sold. Sheriff Burke arrived an hour later, his spurs jangling with a confidence that turned to ash the moment he saw the federal horses at the gate. He dismounted with a slow, oily grace, his hand instinctively going to the badge on his chest. "Marshal Thornton," he called out, his voice a smooth, dangerous drawl. "I heard there was trouble at the asylum. I'm here to assist." Thornton stepped onto the porch, his eyes like two pieces of cold flint. He didn't speak. He simply held up the federal warrant. The psychological collapse of Burke was a cinematic study in ego. The smile didn't fade, it rotted. He looked at the deputies, at the ledger in Thornton's hand, and at the children being led out of the building. He realized then that he wasn't the law anymore. He was a fugitive in his own territory. "You think some papers are going to stop me, William?" Burke hissed, his hand moving toward his holster. But before the iron could clear the leather, Thornton was there, his own pistol leveled at Burke's throat with a speed that defied his age. "The law is done with you, Thaddeus," Thornton said, his voice a low, final judgment. "And so am I." The arrest was a visceral, public humiliation, the digital charcoal peak of the story's conflict. In front of the townsfolk of Helena and the children he had sought to sell, Sheriff Thaddeus Burke was disarmed and shackled. Thornton reached out and physically ripped the badge from Burke's vest, the metal tearing the fabric with a sharp, final sound. The psychological weight of that moment was absolute. The badge, once a shield for corruption, was now just a piece of tin in the marshal's hand. Burke didn't fight. He had the dead, hollow look of a gambler who had finally lost the house. As they led him away toward the federal prison, Mrs. Ashworth followed in chains, her starched dignity finally collapsing into a whimpering, terrified wreck. The paper trail had become a tidal wave, sweeping away the men and women who had built a kingdom on the backs of the broken. Clara watched from the upper window of the inn, seeing the shadows finally begin to retreat from the valley. She had won. The debt of 60 souls was finally being collected, not in gold, but in justice. Zeke Mallister arrived as the sun was dipping below the horizon, his horse lathered and his face a map of the last 48 hours of terror. He didn't look at the asylum or the prisoners. He looked at the inn, his eyes searching the windows until they landed on Clara. He dismounted before the horse had even stopped, his heavy boots thudding against the cobblestones with a frantic, desperate rhythm. He met her at the door, pulling her into a fierce, wordless embrace that smelled of pine and the long, cold road. The cinematic resolution of their reunion was the closing of a circuit. "It's done," she whispered into his chest, her voice finally breaking. "They're all safe. They're all coming home." Zeke didn't answer with words. He simply held her tighter, his large frame shaking with the sheer, overwhelming relief of a man who had finally brought his family home. The dark psychology of the hunt was gone, replaced by the quiet, sepia warmth of a new reality. They were no longer fugitives. They were free. The marshal spent the night organizing the care of the liberated children, but for Clara and Zeke, there was only one place they needed to be. The ride back to Stone Creek was a slow, meditative journey through a landscape that no longer felt like a battlefield. The mountains were still cold, and the ravines were still deep, but the shadows were just shadows again. The historical realism of the homecoming was a quiet symphony of domesticity, the sight of the ranch chimney smoke, the sound of Sammy's laughter as he rode Molly in the distance, and the feeling of the heavy oak door swinging open to admit them. They had walked through the fire, and while they carried the scars, they also carried the light. Clara looked at her copper pot, now resting on the kitchen table in Helena before they left, and realized it was time for it to return to its original purpose. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a vessel for the biscuits, the honey, and the sunshine of a world that was finally, truly theirs. The 10th day was not the end, but the birth of a different kind of labor, the slow, rhythmic work of mending what had been shattered. Stone Creek Ranch, once a digital charcoal sketch of survival and siege, began to transform into a portrait of reclamation. The smoldering ruins of the barn remained a black scar upon the land, a visceral reminder of Burke's final, desperate act, but the air was no longer thick with the scent of kerosene and fear. Instead, it smelled of fresh-cut cedar and pine. A massive pile of new timber had arrived from the mill, the raw wood glowing like honey in the light sepia of the autumn sun. Clara stood on the porch, her hands resting on the rail. She wasn't holding the copper pot as a shield anymore. She was simply a girl watching a mountain of a man and a boy with a new voice work side by side. Zeke and Tommy were laying the foundation for the new barn, their movements synchronized in a quiet, historical realism that spoke of a future they were finally allowed to own. The psychological weight of the fugitive life had lifted, replaced by the grounding, physical reality of reconstruction. Rebuilding a barn in the 1870s was an act of communal defiance against the elements, but at Stone Creek it was an act of emotional architecture. Zeke Mallister moved with a renewed, lighter energy, the granite of his shoulders no longer stooped by the ghosts of Mary Ellen and Emma. He was teaching Tommy the science of the square and plumb, how to ensure a structure could withstand the howling northerns that would eventually come. To Tommy, every nail driven into the cedar was a nail in the coffin of his old life. He was no longer the boy who ran. He was the boy who built. The dark psychology of his trauma was being overwritten by the steady thud, thud, thud of the hammer. Clara watched them, realizing that Zeke wasn't just building a home for the children. He was building a sanctuary for himself, a place where the fire no longer had the final word. While the men worked the timber, Clara and the girls reclaimed the house. The interior of the log manor had been a tomb of dust and forgotten memories, but now the windows were thrown wide, the thin mountain air scouring away the stale scent of grief. Mercy was the heart of this domestic revolution, her humming growing into full, vibrant songs as she scrubbed the hardwood floors. She had a way of turning chores into a rhythmic dance, her psychological resilience manifesting as a refusal to let the silence return. They found old curtains in the attic, fine, lace-edged things that Mary Ellen had once hung with pride, and they washed them in lye and sunshine until they gleamed like new snow. The cinematic quality of the light through those clean windows changed the chemistry of the house. It was no longer a fortress. It was a home. Lily, the youngest, trailed behind them with a rag of her own, her cough a distant memory, her laughter a constant, bright punctuation to the day's labor. The most profound piece of the reconstruction, however, was not made of wood or stone, but of ink and paper. Marshal Thornton had kept his word, and 2 weeks after the arrest of Burke, a circuit judge arrived at Stone Creek. He was a man of a different caliber than Judge Morrison, a weathered, fair-minded jurist who sat at the heavy oak table in the dining hall and looked at the 5 Whitfield orphans and the man who wanted to claim them. The psychological tension of this moment was of a different sort. It was the tension of hope. Zeke sat with his hands folded, his smoke-grey eyes fixed on the judge. He didn't speak of his wealth or his land. He spoke of the girl who had fed his soul and the boy who had found his voice in his stable. He spoke of the copper covenant, the unspoken promise that had bound them together through fire and lead. The legal process was a historical realism study in the power of the written word. When the judge dipped his pen into the inkwell, the room went as silent as the high peaks outside. He didn't just sign an adoption order, he authorized a transformation. Thomas, Mercy, Samuel, and Lily were no longer wards of the state or orphans of Willow Springs. They were Mallisters. They were heirs to a mountain and a name that stood for protection. Zeke's hand trembled as he signed the final line, his signature a bold, unyielding stroke that officially ended their flight. Clara, as the oldest, was legally placed under the guardianship of Widow Harrison to satisfy the territory's rigid codes of propriety, but everyone in the room knew where her heart lived. She stood by the stove, the copper pot simmering with a celebration stew, and she felt the final shard of ice in her chest melt away. "A name is a heavy thing to give a man," Zeke said that night, sitting with Tommy on the porch steps under a sky of digital charcoal velvet. "It's a promise that you'll carry the weight of those who came before you. I'm proud you're carrying mine, son." Tommy didn't say a word. He simply leaned his head against Zeke's shoulder, a gesture of absolute earned trust that was worth more than 1,000 declarations. Sammy's reconstruction was the quietest, yet perhaps the most miraculous. He had become the master of the stables, his connection with Molly growing into a darkly beautiful symbiosis. The horse, once a trigger for Zeke's grief, had become the vessel for Sammy's speech. He talked to her constantly, his voice growing stronger and more fluid as the weeks passed. He would tell her about the minnows in the creek, the way the clouds looked like white buffalo, and the way Clara's bread smelled when it first came out of the oven. The psychological breakthrough was permanent. The wall that trauma had built around his mind had been dismantled, brick by brick, by the rhythmic brushing of a chestnut coat. He was a boy returned from the dead, a living testament to the fact that love is the only force capable of outrunning the law. The ranch hands, led by Jonas, participated in the reconstruction with a fierce, quiet loyalty. They weren't just rebuilding a barn, they were honoring the little cook who had seen them as men rather than tools. They treated Clara with a reverence that bordered on the courtly, removing their hats when they entered her kitchen and ensuring the woodbox was never empty. The dark psychology of the ranch hand life, the isolation, the hardness, the lack of softness, had been tempered by the presence of the children. They were no longer just a crew, they were the extended kin of the Copper Covenant. When the final beam of the new barn was raised, a topping-out ceremony was held, with a cedar branch nailed to the peak to bring good luck. It was a moment of absolute cinematic triumph, the whole ranch standing in the yard as the sun set, their silhouettes cast long and gold against the new wood. As the 11th part of their story drew to a close, Clara found herself alone in the kitchen one evening, the house quiet and the children asleep. She picked up the copper pot, its surface now polished to a high, warm glow, reflecting the flickering light of the hearth. She thought about the journey from the abandoned barn in Willow Springs to the manor at Stone Creek. She thought about the blood she had spilled and the fire she had braved. She realized that the reconstruction wasn't just about the barn or the house. It was about her. She was no longer the girl who merely reacted to the world's cruelty. She was the architect of her own peace. She looked at the blackened dent on the rim of the pot and didn't feel shame. She felt the weight of a warrior who had come home. Zeke entered the kitchen then, his boots soft on the floor. He didn't speak, he simply stood by her side, looking at the pot. He reached out and touched the dent with a calloused thumb. "I'm going to have a smithy fix this," he said quietly. "Smooth it out so it looks like new." Clara shook her head, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "No, Papa, leave it. Every dent tells the story of how we got here. I don't want to forget the price of the home we built." Zeke looked at her, his grey eyes shining with a profound, fatherly love. He nodded, understanding. "You're right, Clara. We keep the scars. They remind us we survived." They stood together in the warmth of the kitchen, the reconstruction nearly complete, the family whole and the future finally beginning to look like sunshine to bread. A full circle has turned, and the Montana sky has transitioned from the jagged, digital charcoal shadows of a winter siege to the soft, light sepia warmth of a harvest afternoon. 1 year has passed since the name Mallister was inked onto the ledgers of the territory, replacing the ghost of the Whitfield orphans with the reality of a family reclaimed. Stone Creek Ranch is no longer a fortress under pressure. It is a monument to the endurance of the human spirit. The air today carries the scent of ripe hay, dried sage, and the sweet, heavy aroma of the cattle being moved to the lower pastures. Clara stands on the porch, a girl of 13 who carries herself with the quiet authority of a woman who has walked through fire and found the other side. She looks at her hands. They are scarred by lie and heat, but they no longer tremble. The psychological weight of being hunted has been replaced by the profound weight of being home. She is the architect of this peace, the one who turned a copper pot into a covenant and a stranger into a father. The kitchen remains the heart of the ranch, but the darkness has been scoured away. The copper pot sits in a place of honor atop the black iron stove, polished until it reflects the golden light of the setting sun like a mirror. It is no longer a weapon of desperation, but a vessel of history. Clara still feels the dent on its rim every morning, a tactile reminder of the day the law tried to break them and failed. There is a deep, dark psychology in keeping such a relic. It serves as a grounded fact, an immutable piece of evidence that they are the authors of their own survival. She uses it to make the sunshine bread every Sunday, the honey drizzling over the golden crusts in a silent ritual of memory. The ranch hands still remove their hats when they enter her domain, their respect for the little cook having matured into a fierce, protective loyalty. They are the unofficial guardians of the Mallister name, men who found a reason to believe in something better than a paycheck in the steam of Clara's kitchen. Tommy, now 11, has undergone a transformation that is a study in historical realism. He is no longer the sullen, watchful boy who slept with a knife in his hand. Under Zeke's tutelage, he has grown into the landscape, his shoulders broadening and his skin darkening under the relentless Montana sun. He is a rancher in every sense of the word, his hands calloused by rope and timber, his mind focused on the rhythms of the herd and the health of the land. The psychological trauma of his father's abandonment has been overwritten by the steady, unyielding presence of a man who stayed. Zeke treats him not as an orphan he took in, but as the heir to the mountains. They move in a synchronized silence on the range, a father and son who don't need words to bridge the gap between them. Tommy has learned that masculinity is not about the puffing of a chest, but about the strength of a promise kept in the cold. Mercy's songs have become the soundtrack of the valley. At 9 years old, she has transformed her psychological defense mechanism, the making of songs to fill the silence, into a gift for the community. She has organized the children from the neighboring spreads into a small choir, their voices rising from the ranch house porch every Sunday like a flight of birds. There is no more humming in the dark to drown out fear. There is only singing in the light to celebrate life. She is the joy of Stone Creek, the one who reminds them all that the world is more than just work and worry. Even the most hardened cowhands find themselves whistling her tunes as they ride the perimeter, a subtle, cinematic sign of the healing that has taken place. Mercy is the proof that joy once lost can be replanted and harvested if the soil is tended with love.